Big news for anyone who loves the history of D-Day. Matt McLachlan Battlefield Tours has just launched a brand new tour that visits the D-Day beaches and lots of other sites in rural France, and all from the comfort of a luxurious cruise on the Seine River. Now, we ran this tour in 2024 and it was a huge success. It sold out in a matter of weeks. So now we've rolled it out again for 2025. But this time, there'll be 3 departures in June, July and September, giving you 3 times the opportunity to join us. The cruise is on board the luxurious Amadeus Diamond and begins and ends in Paris. Over 8 days, you'll enjoy the history, scenery and culture of the beautiful Seine River. But as an exclusive offering just for our passengers, you'll enjoy 2 full days touring the D-Day landing beaches in both the US and British sectors, plus daily seminars on board the ship that unpack the history of D-Day. And like all our tours, you'll be hosted by one of our expert historians who'll bring the story of D-Day to life. And if you've been on one of our tours before, you'll know that our historians really are the best there is. This is an exclusive cruise and places are extremely limited. Visit battlefields.com.au to book your place today.
Explaining football to the friend who's just there for the nachos? Hard. Tailgating from home like a pro with snacks and drinks everyone will love? An easy win. And with Instacart helping deliver the snack time MVPs to your door, you're ready for the game in as fast as 30 minutes. So you never miss a play or lose your seat on the couch or have to go head-to-head for the last chicken wing. Shop Game Day Faves on Instacart and enjoy $0 delivery fees on your first 3 grocery orders. Offer valid for a limited time. Other fees and terms apply. Robinhood is introducing forecast contracts so you can trade the presidential election. Through Robinhood, you can now trade financial derivatives contracts on who will win the U.S. presidential election, Harris or Trump, and watch as contract prices react to real-time market sentiment. Each contract you own will pay $1 on January 8th, 2025 if that candidate is confirmed as the next U.S. president by Congress. Learn more about the presidential election contracts on Robinhood at www.robinhood.com/election. The risk of loss in trading commodity interests can be substantial. You should therefore carefully consider whether such trading is suitable for you in light of your financial condition. Restrictions and eligibility requirements apply. Commodity interest trading is not appropriate for everyone. Displayed prices are based on real-time market sentiment. This event contract is offered by Robinhood Derivatives, a registered futures commission merchant and swap firm. Exchange and regulatory fees apply. Learn more at www.robinhood.com/election.
A Living History production.
I'm Matt McLachlan.
And I'm Pete Smith.
We're battlefield historians who love nothing better than getting out and walking the ground where great battles in history took place.
And now we'd like you to come with us. Every week, BattleWalks will take you to one of the great battlefields of Europe.
As we walk the ground, we'll dig through the pages of history. We'll uncover the secrets of the battlefields, and most importantly, we'll tell the stories of the people who fought and died there.
Welcome to BattleWalks.
Hello and welcome to another episode of BattleWalks, where we are strolling across the great battlefields of Europe. Joining me from France, as always, is my very dear friend and co-host, it's Pete Smith. Pete, welcome back to another episode.
Thank you, Matt. Good to be back again.
Mate, I've got to say, we've talked about this for a long time, but it seems the light is finally at the end of the tunnel. We perhaps have reached the end of the COVID tunnel because things are starting to happen. And let me say to all listeners out there, you can tour now, you can visit the battlefield. So the time is perfect now to book a tour for 2022 because the battlefields are opening up again. And obviously by the time Anzac Day comes around and the European summer, we're fairly confident that the whole COVID thing will be behind us. So Pete, you must be loving being out there and guiding tours again for the first time in a long time.
Yep, last week I had a tour, so that was great to get out on the battlefields again, following in this case on the footsteps of a relative, so that was great. There's certainly more cars about. I was out today having a walk on the battlefields with my Somme pals, so yeah, we're seeing more people around, so it's changing kind of almost day by day. I heard a story today, even while we were walking, that masks are probably going to be dropped soon in France, so not going to be compulsory inside shops and supermarkets and things. So it's going to be down to you whether you wear one or not, and I think that's good. It's giving people more options, and it shows that the government is getting more relaxed about the whole thing. So yeah, onwards and upwards, as they say.
As always, it's down to the individual to decide whether it's right for them to travel at the moment. But what we're talking about here is, I mean, it's still the dead of winter over there in France. This is a time when we don't normally expect people to be visiting the battlefields anyway. And so I'll just say to anyone listening, if you're thinking of wanting to visit the battlefields, 2022 will be a great year for it because it's quieter than it has been at other times. And people visiting Europe are reporting how quiet it is because there's not the crush of tourists yet. So visit our website at battlefields.com.au. And just have a look. There's some great tours coming up, including, Pete, one that we're both very excited about, the Matt McLachlan Signature Tour in September this year, which will be you and I walking across the battlefields, basically doing this podcast in real time on the ground. I can't wait, mate. It's going to be fantastic.
No, I'm really looking forward to it. We're going to some fairly special places as well and locations that we don't normally go to, so it'll be nice to do that. So, yeah, looking forward to that.
I can't quite imagine what it will be like to get back on the battlefields for the first. It'll have been well over 2 years for me since I've walked that ground. I'm jealous of the fact that you get to do it every day, mate, but it's going to be great to be back there with you walking the ground. So if you want to join us, there are still some places left on that tour, the Matt McLachlan Signature Tour. Visit the website and join Pete and I on the battlefields. It's going to be a very, very special event. And speaking of special events, we're doing one today, Pete. We're doing a good walk, which will... Actually, on the Signature Tour, this will be part of what we do. We're focusing today on the town of Messines in the Ypres Salient. Now, this is a place that I really enjoy visiting. One of the first places I visited on the battlefield, and there's just something about it, isn't there, Pete? It's a special story, and it's a special destination.
Well, I'm going to try and not tell the story so much of what went on there. We'll be touching upon it, but it's more about what there is to see and do when you're actually in the town itself. And I think what's extraordinary about it is it's a surprise because we get that image that I've mentioned lots of times in the podcast. That image we get, black and white, flat landscape, waterlogged. Well, this is a ridge, and it's a proper ridge. This isn't, we get ridges that are just like ripples in the ground. This is a proper ridge. You get good views from the top of it. So it's unusual, especially in the area that we associate with a landscape being very flat, that Flanders landscape, because this is very firmly in Flanders, but it's one of those ridges. So the Messines Ridge, you get views. So it's different, it's historic, it's been rebuilt, I have to say, from 20 years ago when I was started to come on a regular basis. It's changed an awful lot, and that's what I wanted to talk about, was some of the changes that have taken place within this small town itself in 20 years that makes it a great location to have a good wander around the battlefields.
It's fascinating, Pete. It's always very interesting to Australians and I'm sure visitors from the UK when they come over, but the distinction between the way the French remember the First World War and the way the Belgians do, and the town of Messines is very much in Belgium. And they do a great job up there, don't they? It's south of the major town of Ypres, the centre of battlefield tourism in the area and the home to the Menin Gate and all these wonderful memorials. But the Belgians do a great job, don't they? It's not to take anything away from the French. The French do a great job as well, but it's quite different from the way the Belgians choose to remember. And I think Messines is a great example of just a local community wanting that connection with the war not to disappear.
There's also a bit more to it than that as well, because when you're in Messines itself and looking out, you're looking out from you're in Flanders, but we're in a Flemish area, so a Flemish language area as opposed to a Walloon area. Belgium split into these almost two nations, two peoples anyway. French-speaking Walloons and Flemish-speaking Flems. And it's right on the cusp, literally down at the bottom of the hill. You're going into a Walloon area, so the language effectively, it's not quite like this, but the language would change to French. And then also, we can look right the way across. We can actually see into France from the top of the ridge as well. So it's a fascinating place to be. And what Matt said is absolutely right. There's more money, I think, put into the tourism certainly in the Flemish regions, but because we're on the cusp of the Walloon regions just below the ridge, they're kind of vying with each other all the time. So they're putting money into, I suppose, developing the battlefields isn't a good time. Just making it easier for the tourist, for the pilgrim, for us to explore. So there's this constant development, and so it does change. It doesn't stand still. You see new things every time you go. You think, oh, that wasn't there last time. And certainly we've been away for quite some time. I'm looking forward to going back onto that ridge and seeing what has changed. And in fact, I had to use Google Earth just to make sure there was nothing obviously that there's a change recently, because when you walk in the ground, you need to know that you're walking to where you think you're walking to. So it's a great place to go because it doesn't stand still.
Well, tell us a little bit about the town, Pete. How many people live there? Describe it a little bit for us in our mind's eye.
Okay, so 1,000 people living there or thereabouts now. So it's a small town. I mean, some people say it's a village, but it's not. It's a town. So it's got shops, it's got bars, more than one. It's got a church. It's got all the things that you'd associate with a town. The one thing that we really need to get to grips with straight away, this place was not just flattened, it was blown away. There was nothing left here at all. And it was bigger. It had been bigger before the First World War than it is now. Many, many more people than 1,000 people living there before the First World War. But it's utterly, utterly obliterated. And it's one of the things that I really wanted to chat about during this podcast, is the point of view of the people coming back in the 1920s. No, I just can't imagine it. You survived the war. You were perhaps saved in the Belgian army. You go back home at the end of the war to your town, and there is nothing there. There is just literally nothing there. Well, what do you do? Nobody's going to help you to start off with. There was no help for a lot of these returning villagers, and a lot of them must have taken one look at their village and thought, "Oh my God, I'm not coming back here." Because apart from the fact that nothing was there, of course, there is a lot of things there, and they're not safe. A lot of munitions everywhere, concrete blockhouses as well. I just can't imagine coming back to this place. And that's part of the story of Messines, I suppose. I should say Messines now, if we're going to be strictly correct. The Flemish-speaking people, it's a Flemish region, and it's called Messines now as opposed to Messines, but everybody still calls it Messines. That's the French version of the town itself. So completely flattened, nothing there at all. You return and you're expected to live in it. And a lot of people said, "No, there's no way I'm coming back here, mate. No, I'm off. I'm going somewhere else." And that's what happened. It was one of those towns that by 1922, 1923, as the redevelopment, the rebuilding is taking place in places like Ypres and on the Somme in Albert and all of those places that we associate with the First World War, well, you could have driven back to Messines and there's still nothing going on at all, because it just filled people with such horror that they had to try and renovate these places, that it's one of the really slow places for people to come back and start rebuilding it.
When you read the books that we've mentioned before, the great Michelin guides to the battlefields that were published immediately after the First World War for the very earliest pilgrims to go back, I recall reading the one of this region that the road from Ypres down to Messines and through White Sheet and that area was one of the worst on the battlefields, and that it was impassable to cars years after the fighting had stopped. The destruction was so complete in that area. And it's always fascinating for me, Pete, when you think about, we've talked about it a lot. We've talked about the pilgrims coming from the UK to visit the graves of lost sons. We talk about the people returning, this immediate post-war era. And it's just a fascinating time, and we have touched on this before, more so in France, but the idea that the young men of the village would go off and fight probably hundreds of kilometres away from where they from where they lived, and go off and fight, and as you say, survive the war, but then come home and find that the town that they had grown up in had also been completely destroyed by the war, because of course for the French and for the Belgians, often the areas that they were fighting in were not the areas around their hometown. So it must have been just overwhelming, the thought that I had to go off to the front and do my best to survive in the horror of the war, and then I don't even get to come home to my hometown like I would have if I'd lived in Paris or in Provence or some other part of Brittany or some other part of France, any other part of France, then to come home and find that the British and the Germans had effectively destroyed your town while you were away. Just heartbreaking.
And there must have been the worry for the Belgians as well, since most of the Belgian countryside was under German control. So only a tiny fragment of Belgium was not under German control. So those Belgian soldiers that had not surrendered and had continued fighting and had slowly been forced out of Belgium almost, they had that extra worry for the whole time that they were fighting, that what was happening to their loved ones, because they were behind the German lines. So what was happening to them? So again, another worry for those men in the front lines still fighting, knowing that their loved ones were behind the German lines. I was just looking at something, because I've got some notes in front of me, and I just wanted to check. L. Haig, after the war, came to unveil a memorial in 1923 to Messines, and that was to the London Scottish. I'm going to talk about it a little later. It's in fact our last stopping point during the walk. But you think that El Haig and King Albert of the Belgians, he came as well for the unveiling of this memorial. And amazing, isn't it? So the building memorials, 1923, and most of the village must have still been fairly flattened by then. There's still only very early stages of rebuilding because it was so slow here. So I just found that interesting. The great and good are coming to I wonder what they thought. They're coming to the town to unveil a memorial on the outskirts of the town, but the town at that point would be nothing structurally other than wooden huts, and not even many of those at that point. So that's an interesting thought as well.
It's just a fascinating time, and one of the things I like about Messines and Ypres and this area is all of these facets of the story are often told quite well. The people returning to the town, the local people, the refugees that had to flee in front of the Germans. So it's a fascinating place. One thing, just before we begin the walk, Pete, I noticed as well in your notes is that Messines is twinned with Featherston in New Zealand, which is a town that was famous during the First World War as the main training camp for New Zealand soldiers. So just about every New Zealand soldier who fought on the Western Front went through Featherston, the training camp there. But just before we started recording, Pete, I was telling you a little bit of a connection with Featherston that neither of us really realised, is that Featherston featured more prominently in the Second World War for a rather bizarre reason. And I've just most of you would know I've just finished writing a book about the Cowra breakout, this big breakout of Japanese prisoners from an Australian prison camp in the Second World War. Well, there was actually a forerunner of that at Featherston. Featherston, the camp that had formerly been a World War I training camp, became a prisoner of war camp during the Second World War. And the Japanese rioted there in early 1943, and about 50 Japanese prisoners were killed, and a New Zealand guard was killed as well during a big riot. And it became effectively the precursor to the Cowra breakout that occurred a year later in Cowra, in New South Wales. So a lot of lessons should have been learnt from that riot at Featherston of the Japanese prisoners in 1943. And sadly, they weren't. And because those lessons weren't learnt, the Cowra breakout occurred, which was on a scale that absolutely dwarfed Featherston. 1,000 Japanese broke out and 234 were killed, and 5 Australians. So, it's again, the little threads of history are just always intertwining. And here we are talking about a Belgian town, and there's that link to Featherston in New Zealand, which is remembered both for the training camp in World War One and the Japanese prison camp in World War Two.
I think there's a podcast here, the twinning of towns, because most Belgian and French towns and villages in the areas of the devastation, they went through a twinning process that took place in the early 1920s with a viewpoint that the towns they were twinned with would help in their rebuilding process. I'm not going to say anything else because I can feel a podcast coming up about this, but it's a very interesting subject, this twinning, this attempt by towns from all over the empire, really, or the Commonwealth, supporting these little French and Belgian towns in the rebuilding process. Now, sadly, it's not going to happen. Hang on, I'm in danger of telling the story, so I'll stop talking.
Let's save that. I think that's a great idea. We'll save that for a future podcast. There's a couple of very famous Australian ones as well, probably most notably Robinvale in Victoria, twinned with Villers-Bretonneux. So, yes, let's absolutely do that, Pete. Let's do a podcast on the twinning. Back to Messines. Let's do a walk.
Okay, so where we're going to park the car, or the coach, we're going to park in front of the Island of Ireland Peace Park. Now, nobody knows it as that. We all know it as the Irish Peace Tower. So this is where we're going to park, and this is where we're going to start the tour. It's just outside of Messines. I think the sign that says kind of "Welcome to Messines" is just there. But a great place to park, and a really good place to have a look at the battlefield. Now, as I said, we're not going to talk too much about the battlefield below us and what went on, but it's just the view. You can park here, walk into the Peace Park. I'm going to explain what that's all about in a second, and you get a fantastic view down onto the battlefield. And specifically, if you're interested in the Australian aspect of the Battle of Messines, so let's just talk about the Battle of Messines. The Battle of Messines that we're going to be really kind of touching upon, and a lot of the memorials and things that we'll see, is from the 7th to the 14th of June in 1917, and that is when people say the Battle of Messines, then that is when they're really talking about it. It's that period. It's the precursor to Third Ypres, to the fighting in the Salient, which will eventually take us to Passchendaele and the fighting at Passchendaele. So this is all happening just before that in 1917. So the view that we get from the Irish Peace Tower is looking down on where the Australian effort, the Australian 3rd Division, attacking on the extreme south, I suppose, of this battlefield, this Messines Ridge, which we're going to talk about as well in a second, what actually that represents. So let's just, before we go any further, let's talk about the Irish Peace Tower. What on earth is this all about? Well, it's fairly spectacular. It's like a pinnacle, a spire, known as an Irish round tower historically, created in Ireland in the 8th century. Obviously, this wasn't created in Ireland. This was built here specifically, but it's been built to represent one of those Irish round towers from the 8th century. I think there were monks predominantly that lived inside them. Very clever, really, in a way. They're just a pinnacle, a very slim spire almost, and the doorway is about 12 foot up, perhaps even a little higher. And so you needed a ladder to get into it. So obviously the owner of it, the person that was living there, climbed up his ladder, opened his door, went into his house, effectively lifted the ladder up and shut the door and said, "Nay, nay, 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 nay. You can't get me now because you can't even get to the door." And then presumably they dropped rocks and things out of windows above to keep them away from the door. Anyway, that's a very brief on an Irish round tower. So
I really like that. I love your potted history. That one was particularly good.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Yeah. Anyway, so why is it here? Well, it's very interesting. It was built in an attempt in modern times to reconcile the two halves of Ireland and the troubles that are taking place in Northern Ireland between the North and the South, the Catholics and the Protestants. And there's a very good reason, because not far from here, further along the ridge, it's slightly not in the right place really, but it doesn't matter because it's relevant. A little bit further away, the two divisions that were fighting on the Western Front at the same time, the 16th Irish Division, predominantly Catholic and from the south, and the 36th Division, predominantly Protestant and from the north, fought side by side here. Now, that had not been the case during the Battle of the Somme the previous year. They had kept them at different parts of the battlefield, I think for fairly obvious reasons. But here, they end up fighting side by side, and it worked very well. They fought together very well. There was cooperation. And so this location is seen as a place where it can be talked about. The problems, the troubles in Northern Ireland can be talked about. And it was felt that this, and it takes place in 1998, would be a great place to build something to commemorate that working together. And so that's what happened. 11th of November 1998, the President of Ireland, Mary McLachlan, and the Queen and King Albert, the Queen, should I say, as in the Queen of Great Britain, and King Albert II of the Belgians, all arrived here for the inauguration. So you can see how important it was seen. You know, these are the top people of Ireland, of Britain, and of Belgium here, the heads of state. That's when it was inaugurated. It's a great, an interesting building to go and look at. You can go inside it, and you can look right up to the top. And in writing this, in scribbling the notes for this, I only just realised that the sun on the 11th of November at 11 o'clock, the rising sun shines inside it and lights up the inside of the tower, which I hadn't realised, not having been there at that period. And so that's a nice little touch. It's got a fairly big, extensive grounds around it with these, what I describe as pillars, these stone pillars that actually tell you little stories. There's some from little stories of the great poets of Ireland from both the north and the south, and also the religious divide. So that's nice to look at. There's all sorts. I won't go into everything. There's all sorts of interesting things to look at on the site itself, and so it's a great place to visit and to chat about. Very often I have people from Australia, from New Zealand, from Canada, from Britain, and from Ireland who have relatives on both sides, from the north and the south, and it's nice to just chat about it and explain a little bit about what's going on and the reconciliation that's been taking place in recent years.
Yeah, it's an interesting one.
Sorry, Matt. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say it's an interesting one, and it, it's not without controversy. You know, the people from Ireland.
Not indeed. Yeah.
It's been argued over long and hard whether it is appropriate or not, and every side it's like much to do with Irish reconciliation. There's fiery opinions on both sides. But it is it's a very nice symbol. It's symbolic of what at least we want to happen, even if it's taking some time. And as you say, incredible views across the battlefield. I go there every time I take people to Messines, simply because it gives you such a great... It's got the best spot on the battlefield to get a view of particularly where the Australians were fighting. And, there's a little bunker in the foreground, a German bunker that was captured by the Nazis. And views all the way down, almost all the way down to the French border. So it's a really good spot to get a good view of the Messines battlefield.
It is, and of course the Irish effort is enormous. Irish traditionally joined the military and have done for centuries. And the estimates that there were over 300,000 Irish serving in the armies. I can't say the British Army, but serving all over the Commonwealth, in all of the Commonwealth forces or Empire's forces that are fighting during the Great War. So I think it's probably going to be over 300,000, because you come across a lot of people that have Irish names and certainly are of Irish descent, and yet will have perhaps one or two generations away from Ireland. So are they still Irish or not? No, well, probably not in that 300,000 list. So I think it's probably more people that would see themselves as traditionally Irish. So yeah, enormous effort. Now the great bit of this site, and I only discovered this a few months ago when I had an opportunity to pop back and do a quick recce on the battlefield to make sure that not too many things had changed. And one of the things I discovered is that from the back of this, you can now connect to our next visit, which is the New Zealand Memorial and the preserved pillboxes there. And so before you had to go back onto the road and you would actually drive up and hang a left and drive down and go to the memorial. Well, now you don't have to. You can leave your car there, and that's what we're going to do, because we're going to make this into a fairly it's not a long walk, but an interesting wiggling walk through the town and the outskirts of the town. We can now walk into the countryside just below the high point of the ridge, past the football ground, over a little pond as well. It's a little bridge. So it's very beautiful and easy walking, and perhaps not so easy if you're in a wheelchair. Very often we look at things, and nowadays it's we need to kind of think about these things, and I'm not sure that you can actually do it in a wheelchair. So you'd need to check. But other than that, it's a great walk that takes us straight now into the New Zealand Memorial at the bottom of the park. They've opened a special gate which brings us in alongside the blockhouses there.
That is good, Pete. That's something I didn't know either, because that is some pretty important ground as well. There's a lot of photos. There's a lot of photos taken of the Australians preparing for the battle across that ground. That was where the New Zealanders charged. So that's great. You can actually walk the ground. It's always been there. It's always been farmland, but it's great. There's a designated walking area now, because the walk up to that New Zealand Memorial is pretty special.
Oh, I find it absolutely fascinating, and why it's even more fascinating to me, of course, it's basically all the time when you're looking to your left, you're looking from the view that the Germans had on the ridge, and the pillboxes are great as well, because they have survived, because they're incorporated into this the New Zealand Memorial. And so it means that we have two of them that are... It's a shame we can't go inside them, but in fact these are not ones that have fire slits. They're not ones that you could actually fire from. These are shelters where the men would fight beside them. So actually, I suppose going inside them, you don't gain anything because you can't see out from them. But they're great, because they're in good condition. They've been well looked after. And we get a real feel of what it was like to be a German soldier just on this ridge during the fighting to take the ridge when the New Zealanders were coming directly towards us, and hence that's why the memorial is here, because this is in the crux of where the heavy fighting took place to get past these bunkers. And in fact, the position that we're in is known as Ulan Trench, if that's a correct... I've always worried about that name, Ulan. It's a German cavalryman, effectively, a lancer. So this was known as Ulan Trench, where we are. Am I pronouncing that correctly, Matt, do you think?
I think you are. That's how I pronounce it as well. My German is even worse than my French, so that sounds like a good effort to me.
I'm not saying anything.
I'm glad you mentioned those, because people who've travelled on tours with me would note that I'm a complete pillbox nerd. I really get the pillboxes that are left over, the bunkers and these concrete fortifications are a really important, tangible reminder of the war, because obviously they only built them in places where they needed protection, so therefore they're always in the front line. And if you find one, you know there was fighting around it, because otherwise they wouldn't have gone to the effort to build one in the first place. And the two in the New Zealand Memorial Park there are two of my favourites, because they're in a very important part of the line. It's a very important battle. We know that they were actively used. The defence wasn't great. The New Zealanders swept over them pretty quickly, but there was a lot of fighting that took place around them. And also the design with the steps up the back. I love that. Yeah. They very neatly demonstrate what we always talk about with pillboxes, that most of the fighting didn't occur from within the pillbox. That they were shelters that as you said before, the shelters the machine gunners would shelter in, and then wait till the artillery barrage had passed, and then rush out of the pillbox and set themselves up. And in these ones, there's actually steps going up the back of the pillbox so that the machine gunners could climb up the back and fire from on top of the pillbox. So quite remarkable. There's a little platform, so you can imagine the Germans still sheltering behind the pillbox, but firing across the top of it. And then even with little ammunition, little enclaves for ammunition built into the side of the pillbox, so they could they could store their ammunition there. So
I think they kept grenades in there quite often. They'd have a little box with your grenades in there as well for your defence when your enemy got close. But it's perfect. It's great. I'll just quickly talk about pillboxes, and again, I think we could. And I can feel another podcast coming on pillboxes. But what's fascinating about the pillboxes is that in Belgium they are protected. So the ones we see here, the farmer can't just come in and start ripping them out. All of the pillboxes connected with the First World War on the battlefields have protection on them, so they can't just knock them down. It doesn't mean you can if you apply, but you cannot just go and take a sledgehammer to it or a JCB and take it down one day. And that's the exact opposite in France. None of them are protected in France. The only way they become protected is if they're in a memorial park. And so it's a very different attitude in Belgium. That they realise the importance, certainly for tourism, and the future of people will want to go and look at these things, and they do. It's something that attracts people because it's tangible, isn't it? You can touch it, you can see it, you can feel it. It's not just a story when you're looking out on a landscape and trying to imagine what it's like, which we do quite a lot on the battlefield tours. You have to, because there's nothing left any longer. So it is nice when you've got something that's tangible and you can actually touch it.
I think they're remarkable too, these pillboxes, because they were built by the Germans right in the front line. So they would have had to build them at night under the watchful gaze of the New Zealanders opposite them. So quite extraordinary. But let's talk about the New Zealanders and the memorial here, because like all the New Zealand memorials, it's pretty special.
It is. I've always loved the New Zealand memorials. They're understated. There's nothing really spectacular about them. They're a pinnacle, a spire, and the very simple fern leaf on them, and that famous phrase, "from the uttermost ends of the earth." And I remember the first time I read that, going back years and years and years, I just found that unbelievably moving. And considering that my house is really where I live, and we're recording this, I live on the New Zealand battlefields, or the edge of the New Zealand battlefields of 1916. And in fact, our house is called Otago View. We commemorate the New Zealanders who fought and died close to where I'm recording this. So, from the uttermost ends of the earth, I've always found as just a simple phrase, but it tells a story. So we have a quick description of the battle as well on the sides in English, Flemish, and French, which basically say the New Zealand division on the 7th of June captured this ridge and advanced 2,000 yards through Messines to their objectives on the eastern side. So that tells us that this is a successful battle. And as I say, not going to go into the actual battle itself, but it was a successful action, and it was very important, and in my view, one of the most successful actions of the Great War. But we're going to do a special podcast discussing the actual fighting here.
Just a shout out to the New Zealanders, because what great work they did. I mean, they get a little bit overlooked, the one division of New Zealanders that fought on the Western Front. Obviously, at Gallipoli, they did great work, and great work on the Western Front as well. Just the New Zealanders were rightly feared by the Germans. They were some ferocious fighters who did brilliant work, often alongside the Australians, and always as part of the British. And so, a huge contribution to the war effort that is oft overlooked.
It is indeed, and thankfully not overlooked here, because we're going to be talking about other memorials and other things that are relevant as we walk into the town. So certainly it's a place where New Zealanders are remembered here at Messines. So we're going to leave the site. We've had a look at the memorial. We're going to walk out onto the road, and we're going to turn right, which will take us back into the town itself. We're just on the outskirts of the town. And here, something extraordinary happened in 2012. I lived in Ypres for a year, in 2012, and we came up here to come and look at some archaeologists working because they were putting a pipeline in, and it's just literally opposite. As you leave the memorial site, turn right to head to the town. On your left-hand side, that's where the pipe work went in, a big long pipe, and the archaeologists came to work here. And it was filmed, and I hate this title. It's a terrible title for a very good documentary. World War One: Tunnels of Death, The Big Dig. And that's what the documentary went out. I think it was on British Channel 4. But it was really, really good and interesting because it was destructive archaeology. In other words, because this big pipeline was going through and then it was going back underground, they decided that what they do is scrape off layers and layers down to the trenches, down to the blockhouses, and then have a look at how they were built and then take off that layer and look at the next layer. Just fascinating. It was absolutely fascinating to watch the archaeologists working there. They found, sadly, not sadly, I think it's actually a good thing. They found a New Zealander who'd been buried there and obviously lost. Unfortunately, they couldn't name him. They were able to identify his battalion, but they couldn't name him. He was buried in the cemetery that we're going to visit during the walk as well. And so, just brilliant. They found a blockhouse, a concrete blockhouse. What they also found, and I found this really interesting, doors and things taken from the village, because the Germans, these are German trenches, as the Germans built these trenches, they used debris from the destroyed village. They took the doors off, and that's great for a bit of revetting and a bit of floorboarding. And so there was remnants of the village in the trenches that had been used. And because it was destructive archaeology, at the end, when they started filling in, there was all bits of timber about, and there was all bits of floorboarding from the trenches. And I have to say, as I went in there, and I gathered up a good armful of floorboards from the trenches, and they're now in my barn. I have no idea what I did that for, but you just can't help it. Well, I can't help myself if there's something, and it's just going to be ploughed back in again. And it's just nice to have some of the duck boarding from an original German trench, say taken by the New Zealanders, so used by them as well. I've got it in my barn as well. So that was fascinating to actually go and see that archaeological work in 2012.
I think that's brilliant, Pete. I would have done exactly the same thing if it was up to me. I would have done the same thing, and my house would be decorated with many of these items. Mine is.
Lots of them, everywhere. I feel another podcast coming on.
Things I found on the battlefield.
Yeah, things in my house.
Where are we heading to next, Pete?
Okay, so as we carry on down this street and back onto the main road that runs through the town itself, right in front of us we can see the church itself. It is an extraordinary church. It's St. Nicholas, the Church of St. Nicholas. It's got I don't know how to describe the tower really. A bulbous spire on it that's kind of got a bulge on top of the spire. So this strange bulge. So it's a very unusual church. It stands out from miles around, and it is an exact replica of what had been there before, built on exactly the same site. Because of course it was utterly destroyed during the fighting. And I find that remarkable, really, that especially remarkable when the area that I live in here, the churches were rebuilt very much in a 1930s style. No attempt to reproduce the medieval churches that had been here before. They used brick and they used concrete, and they're quite Art Deco. In fact, it's quite an interesting subject. These Art Deco churches where I live. Well, in Belgium, in some areas they did that. They built them out of brick and they have an Art Deco look. Perhaps the most famous is in Zonnebeck, a very, very enormous Art Deco church built there. That's on the Salient. But here, they replicated exactly what had been here before. And apparently it's because the people below this ridge, the villages below, could look up and were reassured by this very attractive and unusual spire. At a time when people were very religious, it was there and it was something that they could see from miles around. And so it was decided to put it back exactly as it had been. So that's what we're walking towards. And before we actually go, we're going to just briefly go into the church for a reason that will become apparent, but we're just going to stop and have a look at a plaque that's outside of it commemorating the New Zealander, Samuel Frickleton, VC, a plaque commemorating him. He was a rifleman in the 3rd Battalion of the New Zealand Rifle Brigade, and very close to this spot where his plaque is, he earned a Victoria Cross. Shall I read a little bit? I'll read a little bit about his about how he was awarded it, rather than trying to make it up. So you must excuse. I'm just going to read this. Frickleton's battalion was held up on the outskirts of Messines village by several machine guns firing from the other side of the artillery barrage. With his company suffering heavy casualties, Frickleton, himself slightly wounded, decided to take care of the guns himself. Calling his section to follow him, Frickleton advanced through the barrage to one of the machine gun posts. The smoke and noise of the shelling concealed his approach until the last moment. He lobbed in a grenade, rushed the posts, killed those inside. With his comrades providing covering fire, he then rushed the second machine gun post some 25 metres away, killing its crew and destroying the gun. Frickleton led his men through the village, clearing out Germans lodged in the ruins and other prepared positions. Wounded a second time, he was carried from the battlefield and later evacuated to England. He was awarded the Victoria Cross for his courage and leadership. By the destruction of these two guns, the citation read, he undoubtedly saved his own and other units from severe casualties.
It took a lifetime to find the person you want to marry. Finding the perfect engagement ring is a lot easier. At BlueNile.com, you can find or design the ring you've always dreamed of with help from Blue Nile's jewelry experts who are on hand 24/7 to answer questions, and the ease and convenience of shopping online. For a limited time, get $50 off your purchase of $500 or more with code LISTEN at BlueNile.com. That's $50 off with code LISTEN at BlueNile.com.
Hey, it's Mark Marin from WTF here to let you know that this podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. And I'm sure the reason you're listening to this podcast right now is because you chose it. Well, choose Progressive's Name Your Price tool, and you could find insurance options that fit your budget, so you can pick the best one for your situation. Who doesn't like choice? Try it at Progressive.com. And now, some legal info. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
When it comes to weight loss, no two people are the same. That's why Noom builds personalized plans based on your unique psychology and biology. Take Brittany. After years of unsustainable diets, Noom helped her lose 20 pounds and keep it off.
I was definitely in a yo-yo cycle for years of just losing weight, gaining weight, and it was exhausting.
And Stephanie. She's a former D1 athlete who knew she couldn't outtrain her diet, and she lost 38 pounds.
My relationship to food before Noom was never consistent.
And Evan, he can't stand salads, but he still lost 50 pounds with Noom.
I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. Even through the pickiness, Noom taught me that building better habits builds a healthier lifestyle. I'm not doing this to get to a number. I'm doing this to feel better.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom users compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. At Mint Mobile, we like to do the opposite of what Big Wireless does. They charge you a lot, we charge you a little. So naturally, when they announced they'd be raising their prices due to inflation, we decided to deflate our prices due to not hating you. That's right. We're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
Even more outstanding, I suppose, from the point of view of the man himself, he was actually discharged from the military in Egypt. So when he enlisted, when they got to Egypt in 1915, after the fighting on the Gallipoli Peninsula, he didn't make it to the Gallipoli. He was a reinforcement, so went straight to Egypt, fell in Egypt, and it was decided that he had bad lungs and that he should be discharged. But he re-enlisted in April of 1916 and came back out again. So he didn't have to. And I think it just shows people that felt that it was the right thing to do, that they needed to stop German expansionism, and also for adventure, I suppose, for a lot of these young men. But he made the effort to get himself fit again, and so he could rejoin, and off out he came again. He also had he was one of 5 brothers, and they all enlisted. They all served, and sadly one of them was killed, but 4 of them returned home.
The thing that I think is most interesting about that VC citation, Pete, is that, and I think this is the reason he received the Victoria Cross for attacking 2 machine gun posts, because plenty of people captured 2 machine gun posts and did not receive the VC. I think the key aspect of this that's easy to miss is he ran through the barrage. Now, at Messines, we're talking about a creeping barrage of artillery shells, which was a key part of the success of the battle, was how effective the artillery was. And the descriptions of the barrage at Messines is that it was an absolute wall of fire, an impenetrable wall of fire. So firstly, the Germans that were firing through the barrage, so the fact that the Germans were brave enough to have their heads up and firing through the exploding shells, but then that Frickleton ran through the barrage to attack the German positions is absolutely extraordinary. That in its own right should have gotten him killed, as many men were killed on many occasions trying to, getting caught up in their own barrage. So that's the extraordinary bit of this attack.
I think the barrage here was the heaviest barrage up until that point in the war, wasn't it, if I remember rightly? It could even be for the whole of the war, but it's one of the heaviest barrages, and it certainly was the heaviest barrage up until that point.
This was the first time. And the first time that we really saw that scientific barrage where the artillery worked extremely hard to produce a wall of shells that the Germans, couldn't fight through. So that's even more extraordinary. I cannot believe that I'm reading about someone running through the barrage at Messines is absolutely incredible. So obviously very well deserved Victoria Cross.
And below us, a lot of people miss this. While we're standing and reading the panel that commemorates this act, below us we can see there's some bricks and some bit of concrete, and you just have to look down and realise that there's actually a map of New Zealand there beneath you. So just be aware of it when you're standing there reading the panel. So now, this is almost beside the entrance to the church, so we're going to actually go inside the church. Now, I'll just tell you a little private story here. I had the most fantastic opportunity a few years ago to actually go up the spire to the top, and there's a walkway right near the top that you can walk around. Fantastic it was, but it was very nerve-wracking, I have to say, because it was something like House of Harry Potter. It was a wooden staircase inside, which kind of zigzagged from side to side to enable it to get up, and you could just see it kind of crisscrossing in above you as you walked up, and it was from the 1920s, and it was not overly safety conscious, I suppose. And what was even more worrying, I had a group of school kids with me as well, of students, so that was just marginally concerning. And we got to the top and out onto this walkway around, just fantastic views, but it was just a wooden handrail as well, which was kind of marginally worrying as well. But it was, well worth it, and I do believe that it's now been changed. You've now got an aluminium ladder inside. I think they've improved it, which is a shame, really, because it was an experience in its own right. But I think it's now been improved inside. And I don't know if you can actually ask for permission. I think this was a case of who you know to get permission to go up there. But I've met a few other people that have managed to get up to the top. It's spectacular. If you can figure out how to do it, it's certainly worthwhile going up on top of the spire. The views, you're on a ridge, and the views then from the top of the spire on the ridge, extraordinary. But this is not the reason why a lot of people go into the church. And I just find this, I have to say, it's not something that I concentrate on because I'm not that interested, and I think it's massively overcooked. But the crypt beneath the church is the original crypt. So from the original church, so you're going right the way back to... 1079 was when one of the people we're going to be discussing... William the Conqueror's mother-in-law, Countess Adela of Flanders, was buried there in 1079. And she, her daughter was Queen Matilde of England, so one of the early queens of England, because she married William the Conqueror. So we get the age of the crypt is still the original crypt. Well, that's not what people go down there for. People go down there because Corporal Adolf Hitler was treated here in 1914. Now, I think it's totally irrelevant to what's going on when we're talking about the First World War. I think he'd been gassed. And we know that Adolf Hitler's own personal memoirs of the First World War are rather exaggerated. We know he was a runner. We know he was a runner in the rear areas, not a frontline runner. Yes, he was wounded. He was gassed at the very least. So lots of people go down there into the crypt because they want to go to a place where Adolf Hitler be. I think it's irrelevant. Personally, I think it's a great place to go because it's very interesting with William the Conqueror's mother-in-law being down there, and it's in an area where there's very little left of any great age, pre-1920s. It's interesting to go and have a look at it. But people do go in there just because of the Hitler connection. There's something else that I really enjoy pointing this out, and there's a very small kind of notice that you can miss so easily about the fact that all of the light fittings, these bronze light fittings and a big chandelier in the middle of the church, were created by a German soldier, Otto Meyer, and presented to the church in 1967. And he'd fought there during the war and had seen its destruction and how badly it had been damaged. And in his later life, he felt he wanted to return something back to the town that he'd been involved in destroying, I suppose. And so he presented these light fittings he'd made himself. And I just think they're miles better than the Hitler story. To go and see these and to have a look at them and to realise that somebody had this, I suppose, an element of guilt and made the effort to come back and in 1967 presented them to the town. I think that's a great story.
We should also note with the Hitler connection, Pete, that Hitler did one of his rather crappy
he did.
artist
Yeah, he did,
pieces
yeah.
of the Messines church. Was one of the things when he was in the area that he painted. So it has fame beyond just beyond its physical presence. It's been immortalised by Hitler in one of his second-rate artworks. So there is a strong connection. I agree. It's a bit of a funny one. It has to be mentioned. It's part of history. But
it does. It is. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, There were a number of places on the Western Front where Hitler went, both in the First and Second World Wars, and there we go.
And we're not going to talk about the Australian soldier that had him in his sights at one time. I think that was. I'm not even sure what.
Pete, tell me the story about the Australian soldier who had Hitler.
No, I don't tell that story. I hate that story. It's a load of old rubbish. Anyway,
none of it, it's not true.
It is.
What? Wait a minute. A story about the Australians almost winning the war. Their own. It's a rare tale. It's not true, is it?
No.
Let's carry on walking.
Okay, so we're just going to go outside again, the church. Well, back out. I should say the church inside, well worth having a look around. It's a beautiful church inside in its own right. So if you're interested in churches, even though it's a rebuilt one, in fact, from that point of view, it's interesting to have a look at the engineering that was necessary to create this church in the form that it had been. I think the other thing that I should have said, and I missed it, is that the church before the war did not stand alone. It was part of a convent and a girls' orphanage. It had also been an abbey, and so it was very much more part of a lot of religious buildings put together. And it's actually one of the reasons why the Germans fortified the ridge at this point, because they were always looking for cellars, and the cellars that were connected to the convent were quite extensive. Now the convent has completely gone. It was not rebuilt. It was also an orphanage, so it had lots of uses, and it's no longer there. But it's just an interesting story that it was massively fortified, because they often talk about the command structure that was based in the cellar and the fact it was a medical post. And you're looking at the cellar under the church and thinking, how did this all fit in this small space? It's because this is just a fragment of what used to be here. There were an awful lot more underground chambers connected with the old convent. And finally, while we're in the church, almost certainly, if you're there for more than 15 minutes, you're going to hear the carillon ring, the peal of bells. That's carillon, isn't it? Is that how we pronounce it? Carillon. Now I've said it, I'm not sure. Any ideas, Matt?
I'm not jumping in. You've done well, Pete. Carry on.
Anyway, it's the peal of bells that takes place. 1986, the tower was strengthened slightly. And I saw these bells when I went up to have a look at the walkway at the top. 59 bells, all paid for by various countries. All the Commonwealth countries paid for a bell. And there's one that has cast into it Australia, etc., on these bells. And they play tunes that are relative to the Great War or relative to the countries every 15 minutes. So it's nice to stand outside and listen. Carillon. I think it's a carillon. I think that's how we say it. The bells, the first bells, blessed by Pope John Paul II. Well worth hanging about to listen to the bells playing various tunes, and sometimes you can recognise the tunes and sometimes you can't. I know from experience, I've heard quite a few of them. So where are we going to go now? Walk out of the church, and on the left-hand side, just as you're walking out through the door again, there's a panorama, one of those orientation tables that we get there. Now, sadly, it's kind of the trees have grown up a little bit more than I think when it was first built, but it's a good view. It gives you a good view right the way out of Belgium to Warneton, and Warneton is on the border. Half of Warneton is in France and half of it's in Belgium, the canal in between, so it gives you views right the way out there, and that's over a lot of the battlefield. And it also points out several of those 19 mines. Now, we haven't mentioned them because we're not doing the battlefield, but 19 mines were blown beneath the German positions at the start of the battle, and from this view you can see several of the locations of where these mines were detonated. So, where we're heading now? Well, we're going to head back onto the road again, so leaving the church is behind us, back onto the main road, turning right, which is going to take us into the square in the centre of the town. And then this is where we come across another commemoration of the New Zealand soldiers fighting here. There's a new memorial. It was put up on in the April of 2014. I missed it completely. I missed the actual. You'd think that you'd know about it, that it would be well advertised. Literally 1 week I went past and it wasn't there. The next week I went past and it was there. And it's about a 3/4 size New Zealand soldier in his full kit with his lemon squeezer on his head. And that was unveiled on the 25th of April, as you would expect, Anzac Day in 2014. And so that's well worth having a look at. Not to everybody's taste. I find it as a little garish. It's bright brass as opposed to a dull bronze. I'm never quite so sure of things being bright brass. But anyway, a local artist, Jan... No, I'm not going to say his second name. Dusart. Let's try it. Dusart. Sculptured by Jan Dusart. Yes, well worth going to have a look at that as well.
They do it well, don't they? There's been a few New Zealand memorials that have popped up around the battlefields recently, redressing an absence of them.
Correct.
We've talked about this before, that in the 1990s, Australia went absolutely nuts and built lots of really good memorials all over the battlefields. New Zealand was a little bit slower to do that, but they've rectified that recently. And as we said before, the New Zealand sites should be commemorated, and the new memorials... I like that they're new. They haven't tried to make them look like a memorial that was put up in 1925. Yeah. They're a modern new memorial. They're obviously the modern people of New Zealand commemorating their fallen ancestors, and I think that's a really good thing. They're really neatly done. They're quite subtle, and they tell a good story. I really like them. There's quite a few new ones that I've seen that do a really good job.
Yeah, we've got one in our village, actually. They've literally put one up in the village. It's just a sheet of steel almost with a fern leaf cut into it. But it's also the fern leaf incorporates marching soldiers, so it's very clever with just the basic information about what went on in the area. So yeah, you're absolutely right. They have been putting up more memorials. I think it was necessary for them to do that. So we're now going to walk into the centre of the town, and on our left-hand side, as we walk into there's a green area in the middle. There's a bandstand. It's quite beautiful, and I have to say, been massively renovated in the last 20 years as well. This town was cut off for almost, it would seem like almost 5 years while they redid all the roads. They were putting new sewer pipes in and everything, and so it was very difficult to get to. But in doing that, they then re-cobbled, because I should say most of these roads are cobbled here. So beautiful cobbles. It's a great place to come and stop and have a coffee and go to one of the bars and have a local beer. But what we're going to do is we're going to be standing in front of the town hall, effectively. The flags flying on it, town flags, Flemish flags, Belgian flags. And what we have here is up some steps. We have the Tourist Information Office. Beneath the steps, absolutely crucial on tour, and I know where they all are, we have the toilets. And then to the left of that, we have a little visitor centre. But right in front of it, we have something that you'll either love or you'll hate, and it's a memorial to the Christmas truce of 1914. And this is, I have to say, cast fantastically. This is cast old school, bronze brig, life-size bronze statue, German soldier, Pickelhaube, that pointy helmet on his head, hand outstretched, shaking hands with a British Tommy who's leaning forward, got his soft cap on, and beneath the two is a football. And what it's commemorating is the Christmas truce of 1914, where supposedly there were football games that took place. This one looks like it's the start of an international, apart from the fact that they're wearing uniforms rather than the normal jerseys. I'm not going to say any more about the. It's very controversial over the years. Some people utterly believe in all of these big football games that's supposed to have taken place in various locations. I just say a straightforward thing. Who takes a football into the front line? I think that's... Just think about it. Who would take a football into the front line, and who takes the pump to pump it up when you need it? it's an odd story. I think more likely a few of them had a kickabout because they did come out of the trenches, they did shake hands, they swapped food, they chatted, they swapped photographs. We know all of that took place. And I think in some areas, you can imagine cold soldiers kind of chatting to each other or trying to chat to each other. They see a tin can. Some of them might have even wrapped some kind of rags around it, a bit of string, made it into a kind of a temporary ball and just kind of kicked it to each other backwards and forwards. There was no international games anywhere up and down the Western Front. So it's, but over the years it's got more and more exaggerated and things put together, and then we get the film Joyous Noel, where we also get an opera singer and a grand piano in the front line as well. So it's kind of it's been massively exaggerated. But here we have an example of really, you have to say, it's just commemorating that camaraderie of the trenches that took place in 1914. Ignore the football, two chaps shaking hands, and it's okay. And it's good for children and students that come here and want to know a little bit about what went on. It's a bit of uplifting in what can be a fairly miserable experience if you're not really into battles and warfare. So so I don't object to it, but you just have to put it in its perspective. And it is extremely well sculptured, I have to say.
It's an interesting one. I mean, Messines is the heart of the Christmas truce. This was where most of the reports came back about the Christmas truce in 1914 in this area, so it's a good focal point for it. Yes, I agree. The stories of the Christmas truce have been blown out of proportion. In an odd way, they've been derailed a little bit, because I think the story of the Christmas truce, I'm not trying to downplay it, I think the Christmas truce, in the reality of the Christmas truce, is an incredible story, and moving. It doesn't need embellishment. And this, particularly the football game, has derailed the story, because I don't know why. For some people, the idea that the soldiers simply met and chatted and exchanged gifts wasn't enough for them. They needed a football match, and the whole thing, it's been blown completely out of proportion. And look, let's not take it away from them. I mean, the one thing I will say about that with your description too, Pete, is anyone who's seen photos of no man's land during the First World War would note that it's a sea of shell craters and barbed wire, and I'm not quite sure where they would have played this amazing football game. But let's not get bogged down on that. I think it's important that people connect with that humanity, and there's a number of sites in this area.
Correct. Yeah.
To do that. I mean, the UEFA Memorial out next to Prowse Point Cemetery is just awful.
Let's not talk about it. It's almost as bad as the windmill at Poitiers. Let's not talk about that either.
So there'll be a whole podcast about new, terrible private memorials. But
yeah.
But look, I agree. It's a lovely, what that sculpture. It's a beautiful sculpture, and it captures the sentiment very well, if not the historic fact very well.
Yeah, so, indeed.
As you say, it's a nice focal point in the town.
It is. The Visitors Centre, which is just behind it, literally automatic doors open by themselves. It's unmanned. Part of the tourist office, which is above it. Fantastic. It's just fantastic. You can go in there. Nobody's there. You can spend as long as you want inside it. And a rainy old day, you spend a bit longer than you wouldn't if it's not a rainy day, or if the bars are closed, you spend a bit more time in there. But it's got all sorts of films that are constantly running on loop, so you can watch several films about the rebuilding of the town, stories about the fighting that took place, shelves of souvenirs, things that have been found in the various archaeological work and by farmers brought in. So great. It's just a great little tiny visitor centre that's packed full of all sorts of stuff that just gives you a little bit more of the story of the town. So I love it. I always go in there. A lot of people just go straight past it, don't even notice it. But it's well worth popping into the visitors centre. I think it's described as an information point in some of the literature, but it's a bit more than that. I really like it. So.
It's very well done. Like everything in Messines, it's very, very well done.
It is.
A credit to the people of Messines and
it is. I agree.
Further afield in Flanders, because everything in this town is really well done. They've done it very, very well.
Yeah. So then, if we're at lunch, then we have an opportunity to go to the bars, and there are quite a few bars. Occasionally, you hit it when nothing's open, but normally, if you have a rummage around, then one of the bars will be open, and some of them do food as well, so you can eat something there as well. But at the very least, you can get a coffee or a beer. So where we're heading now? Well, we're going to carry on back onto the main road again. So leaving the square and the town hall and the bandstand. What I should say as well, there's also the remnants of a field gun in the middle of the square there as well. I've never been quite sure because it is literally the remnants. There's a bit of the barrel. I think it might be a 4.5-inch howitzer, but equally it may not be. It could be something German. I'm not sure. It doesn't say anything about it, but have a look for it. There's the remnants of a field gun there, just opposite the visitor centre. So back onto the main road, turn right, carry on along. We're heading in the direction of White Sheet if we were walking out of the town. And then we're going to get to a crossroads and we're going to turn left. And this is going to take us, first of all, to a cemetery, Messines Ridge, a New Zealand Memorial, and the cemetery that's associated with it, Messines Ridge British Cemetery. But before we get there, we're going to go past something that's, again, associated with the Irish Peace Tower. It's called the Peace Village Hostel nowadays. Now, I've stayed in it. It's a hostel for student groups in the main. So there's accommodation for the driver and the guides, and then there's lots of kind of bunk accommodation for students. It's a fantastic place to go to. I've really enjoyed it. You can have a bit of fun there. The food is fairly basic in the morning, but really good fun. Great place if you're looking for a group of students and you just want somewhere to stay, which is interesting. You can do this walk that we're on at the moment from there as well. So I really like it, but it has a funny old story. It was originally built by the Northern Irish as a place to bring students out onto the Western Front to learn about the cooperation between the two sides of the Troubles in Northern Ireland and Ireland. It didn't really work particularly well, and in the end, it was decided to hand it over to the Belgian government that they should run it, and they run it basically as a peace school. And so students come from all over Europe to stay there, not just from Northern Ireland. They still do come from Northern Ireland. Very little from the south of Ireland, but mainly Northern Ireland. But they come from all over, and it's I think it's not quite doing what it was originally intended to do, to bring students from both sides of the divide. But it still brings lots of students. And I've taken multiple Australian student groups there and British student groups. So it's a good place to go to. What you can do as well when you're there, you can take them down, and as we're going to do, and walk down to the Messines Ridge New Zealand Memorial. Now, this is a memorial to the missing. What I should say as well, there is yet another memorial to the Christmas truce here. I'll just quickly talk about it because I don't want to concentrate on this Christmas truce too much. But there's another granite pillar here in the grounds of the Peace Village, and it's just inscribed with a lull in the hate. And again, it was the British and German ambassadors in this case attended its unveiling in 2014. It's made out of granite, polished granite. It's just got a football on it. So again, reference to the football game. So it is a bit of a student thing to concentrate on the football game, but I suppose it's there and tells a story or a continuance of the story of the Christmas truce. So we're going to walk past that, and we're heading down now out of the village again, to the edge of the ridge where we get these fantastic views again, and it's on our left-hand side, and we're going to go and have a look at the Messines Ridge New Zealand Memorial, which commemorates the missing. And I just think it's extraordinary. 828 officers and men commemorated in a circular fashion, cross of sacrifice above it, and how to describe it? It's like you're in a circular trench, and in the middle of that circular trench is this memorial with all the missing soldiers' names, officers and men on it, and then above you is the cross of sacrifice. I think it's stunning. It's a very cleverly designed memorial. Charles Holden designed it, and it's one of the 7 memorials to the New Zealand missing, because of course we have talked about it before, but you may not have listened to the podcast. New Zealand decided to do something different to Australia. Australia commemorates, or Canada. Australia and Canada commemorate their missing in 2 locations. The missing of Belgium on the Menin Gate. The missing of France for Canada at Vimy Ridge, and for Australia at Villers-Bretonneux. So it's central commemoration points. New Zealand decided not to do that. I suppose it's a bit more like what the British did, really, is that we commemorate on each battlefield or area, and that's what the New Zealanders decided to do, to commemorate their missing on each battlefield. And so this commemorates the missing soldiers fighting on the Messines Ridge or around the area around it. So
it's well done, isn't it, Pete? It's a nice thing to
fantastic.
do that when you go to these battlefields and you know that the New Zealanders were there, and then you see a New Zealand memorial. They're never very big. You know, this one's got less than 1,000 men. I mean, that's a lot of men, but compared to the 70-odd thousand, the Tietval Memorial, or the 50-odd thousand of men and gate, it's a small number, but it adds a lot of character to each site. I love what the New Zealanders have done. You go there, there's generally a memorial to New Zealand from the uttermost ends of the earth. They're all very similar to each other. And then you have this memorial to the missing. You've got it in Polygon Wood, you've got it at Passchendaele, you've got it here at Messines, Longueval on the Somme, numerous other places. But it's very, very well done. I really like it. It reminds me a little bit of what happened at Gallipoli in the Anzac sector, where you go to each of these central battle points, and when you get there, there's a cemetery, and you can see the men that were killed in that area. I think the New Zealanders have done it very, very well.
Yeah, I think it's excellent, and I had to scribble down a name because there's 7 memorials to the missing on the Western Front, 6 of which I know very well, and the 7th is a place called Marfo. Let's go Marfo, and I think I've only been once to it. It's right off the battlefield, so it's a place that very few people would go to, or right off the regular battlefield. And I think I've only been to it once. The others I go to on a regular basis. Also, just to point out, all of this is taking place on a site where there was once a windmill. There was once a windmill here, and if you're on this site, you'd realise why. It is quite, well, a lot of these places. In fact, you could say that on the Western Front, where most of the memorials are, they're in locations that give you excellent views across the battlefield or the landscape, which means that they're also fairly windy. And so, yes, there was a windmill here. It had been built in 1445, so it was a very old windmill, and it was connected to the hospice in the town. So Moulin de Hospice, it was called, and not rebuilt, obviously. But there are some stones about that look very old, so you can see in the fields bits of it still around about. So from that, as we walk through this, so we have a look at the memorials of the missing. It's also the entrance to the cemetery, Messines Ridge British Cemetery. And it's one of those cemeteries, that you can literally spend ages in here because you've got the views to look at. It's beautiful. It's got trees within it. It's got this memorial to look at. It's one of those ones that you can spend a long, long time here. 1,536 burials or commemorations, so it's a fair-sized cemetery, but sadly, like a lot of them in this area, 957 of those are actually unidentified, and that's about the ratio for this area. An awful lot of the soldiers brought in here after the fighting. This is a concentration cemetery, and so with concentration cemeteries, we have an awful number of unidentified. Now, I came across something when I was compiling the figures for this. You always have to go to the most modern kind of figures you can find, because, of course, one of the issues we have here is that we are still finding bodies. And where are they being buried? Well, this is an open cemetery, so the numbers, bizarrely, you wouldn't think they would, but they're increasing all the time. The other thing I noticed is that on one of the various sites you can go to look at the figures, they'd counted the number of Australians here, and they said 322, which I'd found elsewhere. And then I thought, well, hang on a minute, why are they now saying 204? Because I suddenly realised that 322 Australians included the unknown Australians. So the unknown Australians, it will say an unknown Australian soldier, or a soldier known unto God, and so it will tell you that he's Australian, but we don't know his name is. Well, then which list do you put those under? Do you put them under the unidentified, or do you put them into the Australians? So it's the first time I've ever noticed the difference between named 322 322 Australians in total, and 204 of those are named. And so we've got the same figures: 115 New Zealanders, of which 67 are named. 56 South Africans, of which 10 are named. So I just found that interesting. I hadn't noticed before that you could do it like that, because you can't do that by anything other than counting the headstones. There's no way you can do that by looking at any records. They don't give you the split of unknown soldiers by nationality. You have to, generally speaking, physically go and look.
That's an interesting little point, Pete. It's also quite shocking, the numbers, isn't it? Just to, again, the thing we talk about all the time with the First World War, the scale of death and the number of men that were missing and lie in these cemeteries under unknown headstones. Just always essential that we call into these cemeteries and
they never cease to. Yeah, never cease to move me, Matt. You'd think we've been doing this for 20 years, and I live here, I live amongst them, I go and visit them all the time. But you just find yourself drifting away with it. I can't describe it. You read an inscription and you want to know more about that man. What is that man doing here? Where did he come from? And you can't help it. I've got photographs and photographs on my phone of people that I need to look up to find out why they were there, because they caught my interest. And in fact, I took some today. I literally visited 2 cemeteries today, and I thought, that's interesting. I'll take a picture of him, and I wonder why he's here and what happened to him. And there's either something unusual, or he's very young, or he's very old, or he's just very average. You just think it's just interesting, and something will catch your attention. So I find them very moving, and the visitors book you can find extraordinary. Go and look at the visitors book. Have a look at who visited the last time, and of course, very sad at the moment, but unbelievably sad. We look at the visitors books, and they've had, last year you'll find 2 or 3 names people managed to get out and visit, and I can't wait until we open up the visitors books again and see pages and pages of interesting comments by people who are visiting, which we've not got at the moment. So I look forward to this year when we get the people coming back and looking at the cemeteries again and making comments in the visitors books.
I agree, Pete. Well said. What's the last stop on our tour, Pete?
Right, well, this is a little bit of a walk. I wasn't going to include this, and we've already mentioned it. It's the London Scottish Memorial, which is just outside of the town. So back to the crossroads, back into the centre of the town to the crossroads. Turn left, heading out again on the road to White Sheet, the next village on the ridge, on the Messines Ridge. And on the right-hand side, just outside of the town, well, it's a little bit more than just outside of the town, is a memorial to the London Scottish. Now, London Scottish are a territorial battalion based in London, as you'd expect, and predominantly from people who are Scottish. I suppose the name tells you what they are, really. But part-time soldiers. But they were the very first territorial unit to go into action. So very, very famous. 31st of October 1914. Remember, it's regular soldiers with the territorials following them up, being called up and shipped across to France. So this is the first unit that went into action. I always remember the story of them, and so it's just worth recounting. They had the old Longley Enfields. They hadn't got the modern SMLE, the modern rifle that we generally see in photographs of the Great War or paintings of the Great War. This is the earlier weapon. And it hadn't been converted properly to take a pointed round. So a modern round of the First World War goes to a point. The previous rounds associated with, I suppose, the Boer War or interwar period between the Boer War and the First World War, they had a round. They didn't go to a point. They were rounded at the end, and it meant that they fed into the rifle nice and smoothly when you were cocking the bolt and pushing it forward and taking the round into the weapon to fire. But these hadn't been altered to take a pointy round, and it jammed. And so they were able to fire once as they advanced, and then most of the soldiers advancing couldn't then reload because the rifle had jammed, because the next bullet with a pointy round stuck into the breech and jammed it. And so they went into action on that first day mainly using the bayonet because their rifles are jammed. So it's a rather horrific story, but an interesting story about this first territorial unit going into action with slightly outdated weaponry that hadn't been. There was a correction you could do to it to alter it. It was quite easy to do, but these had not been changed. They suffered 400 casualties during the attack before they were eventually withdrawn. So a tough entry into the war for this very first territorial battalion to see action. And as I said, their memorial, this is where they decided at the end of the war to place their memorial. And it was unveiled by King Albert of the Belgians and Haig, who commanded the forces in 1923. So well worth going to have a look at. It takes the form of a Celtic cross, if you hadn't described it, but it takes the form of a rather attractive Celtic cross.
It's a great demonstration, Pete, of how static the lines actually were for the first 3 years of the war, that there was still 3 years later, they were still fighting on exactly the same spot. Whereas if you compare that to something like Normandy in World War II, they were advancing kilometres and kilometres every day. And that entire campaign only took 10 months. So just extraordinary.
I think it also shows you, doesn't it, how well built the German defences would have been. because if you've not been moved off this ridge and you've been here since 1914 and eventually you will be moved off it in 1917, you had a long time to perfect your fields of fire, to perfect your dugouts, to build the concrete blockhouses, and that's why it's such an extraordinary battle in 1917, so well planned and so well organised. And as I say, we will do another podcast about the fighting, the actual physical fighting to take the ridge, because it was a very well planned and executed battle to take the Messines Ridge.
Well, Pete, it's an extraordinary little corner of the battlefield. It's an area I love visiting, and it's been great to walk just around the town and see these sites in depth, because we often whiz through there seeing other parts of the battlefield without paying enough attention to what's going on in the town. So I've really enjoyed this, mate. Thank you so much. It's been wonderful to do it in your company, and I can't wait to do it again in person in September when we walk the battlefields together.
No, I'm looking forward to getting back onto the Messines Ridge, because it is, on a good day, the views are spectacular, and even on a misty day, that you get a good idea of what's going on. So yeah, it's highly recommend that you spend some time here if you're exploring the battlefields by yourself.
Well, thanks, Pete. We'll talk to you next week.
Yep, looking forward to it, Matt.
Thank you very much for listening. Don't forget to follow us through social media, where you can learn more about each episode we've just recorded on Facebook and on Twitter. Under the tag BattleWalks, you can find us there, and more information about each episode. Also, if you would like to support the podcast, you can now buy us a coffee. This is a great way for fans of the podcast to contribute a small amount, which really helps keep the podcast going and bring you new episodes. So if you want to support us, go to buymeacoffee.com/BattleWalks. Thank you for listening to us, and we'll see you next week.
$1-800-Flowers.com knows that a gift is never just a gift. A gift is an expression of everything you feel and helps to build more meaningful relationships. 1-800-Flowers takes the pressure off by helping you navigate life's important moments by making it simple to find the perfect gift. From flowers and cookies to cake and chocolate, 1-800-Flowers helps guide you in finding the right gift to say how you feel. To learn more, visit 1-800-Flowers.com/ACAST. That's 1-800-Flowers.com/ACAST.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
The pandemic may have faded from the headlines, but for some reason, the questions haven't. Was COVID actually a natural disaster? What happens when the scientists and the science are at odds? Who are we supposed to trust? From award-winning director Jenner Furst, check out his new documentary, Thank You, Dr. Fauci, available now. Go to tydfmovie.com to learn more.